Content warning for basically everything. Graphic violence of every kind, references to sexual violence of adults and children, discussions of force feeding with a tube, forced coprophagia. It's easier to just assume that this video isn't for you if you have any particularly strong aversions. I think extreme horror aficionados are so tired of being called weird for liking extreme cinema that they've accidentally developed a really bad argument to counter it. If it disturbed you, it did its job, is an argument I see all too often. It's an argument I saw littered across the comments section of my video on the first sequence of the Human Centipede. There was one absolute soldier who replied to every comment featuring even a modicum of criticism against the movie that the critique was void because the movie had completed its objective by making you uncomfortable. Seriously, go and look, that guy spent hours trawling through my comments getting into fights with everyone. No doubt it did wonders for the algorithm though, so I let him get on with it. If a piece of media has a task it sets out to do, it is not magically good media because it completes that task. If the Sims freeplay mobile game exhausts me so much with wait times spanning days on minor tasks that I cave and pay for some premium currency to hurry it along, the media has achieved its objectives. That doesn't mean the game is without fault. Is the Edge Runners series impossible to critique because it gave your teenage son an erection? Did Fear and Hunger achieve its objectives because it made you scared and hungry? I've not played that one, sorry, I don't know what I'm talking about. While I can appreciate horror fans being sick and tired of getting dumped into the weirdo pigeonhole for liking horror, you can't critique this movie because it made you uncomfortable when you watched it is an argument that has accidentally reached the other side of the horseshoe spectrum of media engagement and come back around on itself as an argument that devalues extreme horror just as much as the points that they were arguing against. Anyone would find it uncomfortable to watch people get sewn anus to mouth. If you send someone a cartel snuff film and they go, "That was really gross," does it mean you've sent them an Oscar winner? No. Horror fans, do not reduce your own genre of choice to reaction farming. There are a lot of reasons to like extreme horror. It is one of the most versatile and allegorical genres. Stating it doesn't need to be held to the same standards as its cohort genres implies that it is not good enough to be expected to meet fundamental expectations. Good writing, good plots, good characters, good cinema. Extreme horror is totally valid, so treat it like it is and hold it to standards worthy of any movie. Alright, cold start. Tick. Implicitly demonstrating my respect for extreme horror so you know I'm not going to criticize this movie for being too extreme. Tick. Janky checklist bit. Tick. Smooth and effortless segue into talking about today's sponsor Brilliant. Tick. Brilliant is returning to partner with us once again as we embark on our odyssey of discovery through the Human Centipede 2. Brilliant is a fantastic daily learning app full of bite-sized interactive lessons that help you learn all about maths, data science, and programming. Featuring catalogues crammed full of lessons on everything from Pythagoras to Python, there will always be something new you can learn. Dip your toes into Brilliant's catalogue of data science content, perfect for learners of any level to try data for the first time or pick up where they left off. Courses on everything from visual data to regression and classification will introduce you to and hone your skills with data visualization, the function of algorithms, and purpose of regression models, and so much more. Data is a lot like what we do here on this channel. We take something massive, like a book, movie, or TV series, and interpret it. It's a massively useful skill and well worth the investment. Build new skills from the ground up or polish existing ones with an app that actually contributes something of value to your daily routine. No mindless doom scrolling before getting ready for work, no texting your ex after a night out with your friends, no flicking back and forth on the weather app when you don't know when you want it to function. Get on Brilliant and make something good from an idle 10 minutes. Try everything Brilliant has to offer for free by visiting brilliant.org/merkkk. You'll also get 20% off an annual premium subscription. Thanks, as always, to Brilliant for sponsoring today's video. Before we talk about the Human Centipede 2 properly, we need to talk about the ending. The Human Centipede 2 starts and ends on the same scene in which our main character Martin is watching the first film on his computer at work. A few shots of the first movie would have been perfectly serviceable just to show us that this is an in-universe viewing of the Human Centipede, especially when he moves the cursor and we see he's watching it on some Windows Movie Player knockoff, but we see the entire ending of the first movie play out in a way that felt intended to pad the measly 87-minute runtime. When the latter third of this movie is essentially going to be spent watching the torturous pantomime of a madman inspired by Dr. Happy from the first movie, you can totally see where other segments of the film were padded to add minutes to the runtime through whatever means were available. This is the worst offender, and it's also the first 5 to 10 minutes. As the movie ends, the camera cuts to Martin. He's deep in thought, pensive, intrigued, glistening with sweat, cogs turning in his brain. And if the ending of this movie is to be believed, this is where the actual real physical story ends. Yes, the remaining 80 90 plus minutes, depending on the cut you see, are, according to the ending of this film, entirely in Martin's mind. We see over an hour of gore and depravity, only for the final moments of this movie to return to the exact same shot of Martin thinking. The implication here is that the entire story of The Human Centipede 2 is just his strange fantasy. When the movie cuts to black, we are left to decide for ourselves whether he goes on to commit this crime or whether he proceeds to live a relatively normal life. Personally, I hated this ending. I hated it. I don't disagree with the premise of this movie at all. I thought the concept was very creepy, very compelling. I thought it nailed extreme horror and extreme gore. It had me in the fetal position in some particularly unwatchable moments. That said, this movie is not a good movie. It's unabashed and self-indulgent, presented on a platter of 5 out of 10 acting and 2 out of 10 writing, and it could have been great. Yes, it completed its objective of making me uncomfortable, but did it do it well? No. This choice of ending seeks to achieve a few particular things, none of which I respect. Firstly, rendering the entire movie a wank fuel fetish dream does little but seek to dissuade actual criticism. It is so obviously a way to write through plot holes. The Human Centipede 2 is rammed full of plot holes. Why can none of the Centipede participants escape from a few strips of duct tape? Why does no one investigate all the murders and kidnappings in the garage Martin works for? Especially since we know they occur on camera, since he's the security guard. There are so many moments this movie asks you to suspend your disbelief, and I am watching The Human Centipede 2 because I want to be revolted, so I nod my head and I allow all these weird leaps of logic to pass me by so that I can settle in for the horrific crescendo of this ghastly orchestra, and then none of it ever happened in the first place. This is so obviously done so that anyone who asks, why don't the participants just get out of their extremely flimsy restraints, is met with, because it's not real and it never happened. Which is strictly true, but it's a cowardly and smug way to write a story that has a magical get-out-of-jail-free card that pops up in the face of any kind of critique. Instead of sitting down and writing, oh, I don't know, a competent story that makes sense, which I know this movie could do with even a drop of elbow grease, The Human Centipede 2 shorted out whatever first draft made it out of the writer's room, pinned a fuck you ending to it, and called it a day. The second reason is more of an issue of personal preference. To be fair, this whole video is a circus of personal preference, but this is extra personal. Personally, I like my extreme horror to commit. If you're going to show me 30 minutes of the most heinous, toe-curling visuals I've ever seen, I'll respect you for it a lot more if you take your bow at the end. If you show me 30 minutes of misery and go, haha, stupid, that never happened, I'm gonna be like, oh, okay, never mind then. Tonally, it's pure whiplash. None of it happened, meaning there are no consequences, and in extreme horror it's often the consequences that linger with me the most, not the actual gore. After watching Gaspar Noé's movie Climax, I felt pretty unperturbed until the morning after, when my mind suddenly flashed to a moment late in the movie where a character is electrocuted, and I felt sick for the rest of the day. I felt sick because the character's family was present, I felt sick because I was beginning to mentally interface with the sudden loss of life, how that character must have felt in their last moments, and the sad quiet stillness of the state their body was found in, senseless, depressing waste. If, at the end of that movie, it had been revealed to have been a dream, there are no consequences that would linger with me. Visually, someone getting electrocuted is not that intense. That memory isn't the problem. It's the stillness afterwards, the context, the wider impact, the fact that it never needed to happen in the first place, the tragedy. When I watch a movie like The Human Centipede 2, I want to walk away feeling disturbed. I want to flash back to the misery of the unwitting participants. I want to reflect on the discovery of the crime scene. With a fake-out ending, I find my disturbed feelings suddenly dilute. It becomes a picture someone drew in isolation, rather than the protracted nightmare it could have been. So I'm gonna do us both a favour. To save you from me whining about how this and that was ruined by the ending of this movie, I'm going to talk to you today as though the ending of this movie didn't happen. I know that means I'm basically reviewing an incomplete version of the film, but fuck it. If you don't respect your own work enough to write it well, I won't respect it enough to review it as it is. The Human Centipede 2 follows the story of a man named Martin. Martin is obsessed with the Human Centipede, which exists as an in-universe movie in The Human Centipede 2. The movie is entirely in black and white, which is a choice. Sometimes I felt as though the black and white really added to the vibe, and sometimes it felt poorly considered and cliche. Initially, The Human Centipede 2 was shot in colour, and there's a particular collection of all three movies spliced together which includes the colour version. I don't really buy DVDs, and a copy of that collection comes in at around 30 quid, and I didn't want guests to look at my DVD shelf and see only a single copy of the deluxe complete collection of the Human Centipede series, so I forewent the investment. You can tell there was at least some consideration for the the final cut being in black and white. Like, it was always something Six flirted with from the beginning. There are no scenes that are totally ruined by black and white. The scenes I felt really benefited from being in black and white were the more extreme ones, especially a scene in which Martin bludgeons his mother to death and then eats breakfast opposite her at the kitchen table. She is a mess of teeth and brain and hair and shattered skull fragments. There's a remnant of skull left, some rough outline of something that was once a human face, but her personhood is entirely mangled. She's unrecognisable. Visually, this combines so well with the black and white because the black and white lessens the contrast between the mess of gore. You can still see what's going on, roughly, but it adds a cipher to her corpse. You have to work hard to peer closely enough to discern what's what. Moments of still silent horror, where the camera focuses on an unmoving mess of extremity, are best suited to the black and white because you're not so much looking at a straight picture of gore as you are a grisly photocopy, a newspaper clipping. The brain has to work harder to build an idea. Counter to that, the black and white shots struggled most in scenes of intense motion. As the movie goes on, things get messier and messier, shots cut faster, momentum reaches a boiling point. This occasionally serves the scene well by introducing a mess it's difficult for the eye to sift through. The introduction of poop to later scenes is one such instance. Since blood is dark red and poo is brown, they are the same colour in black and white. You'll often be looking at shots, seeing fluids all over the place, and grimly wondering what the ratios are. That's quite effective as far as visual horror goes. That worked well. In other instances, the contrast, especially in lighting, was not stark enough for it to work well in black and white. There are some fantastic shots where Martin is starkly white against a grim dark background, but there will be just as many shots where he muddles miserably in with the rest of the palette. Things are awkward to look at. Sometimes this might be intentional, but sometimes it's clearly not, especially in the larger shots where the camera takes in the entire room of the warehouse he keeps his new pet in. The black and white feels like a hindrance here, weirdly. There was a subconscious part of my brain that wanted to press some button on my remote to fix the screen. It often felt intended for full colour. Six claimed he shot in colour with a consideration to release the movie in black and white, but a lot of this movie made me wish he'd just picked one or the other and committed from the beginning. Yes, I can see that there was some consideration to accommodate black and white, but I don't think maybe we'll change this to black and white later is a good enough basis for preparation. When it worked, it was great, but that felt almost coincidental considering the many times that it didn't work. Another quirk of the black and white colour scheme is well, there's no easy way to say this, the diarrhea party, the laxative rave. There's a point in the film where the entire human centipede goes boom boom all in each other's mouths, and Martin's no surgeon, not like Dr. Hater, so it's a messy operation. Poop is spraying everywhere. Even the girl at the back poops up the wall behind her, and the spraying poop is the only part of this movie that's played in colour. Just the bubbling brown river pouring out of every hole in the room. That was all the colour there was. I looked at Marcus while we were watching this and said, with full bewilderment, is this supposed to be like Schindler's List? And he did not have an answer for me. That was an unusual choice. I suppose it added to the grossness factor, but the black and white visuals worked so well with the blood and the shit because of the uncertainty of what was spraying out of where. I already knew it was poop. Making it marron didn't really add much to my experience. I felt as though Six really wanted something in this film to be in colour but couldn't decide what, so he went for the most arbitrary thing, and also accidentally drew parallels to Schindler's List in the process. Martin Lomax never speaks a word across the entirety of the Human Centipede 2, but that doesn't mean we don't have a pretty thorough idea of what's going on in his head at any one time. Mainly, yes, because we're living it, but also because his actor, Lawrence Harvey, plays his role very well. Although he'd done dribs and drabs of work in children's television in the 90s and noughties, Lawrence's career in film happened because of his performance as Martin Lomax in the Human Centipede 2. Being from Wigan, he was arguably born for this role. Martin being mute rendered the first spoken line in the movie a surprise for me, because, to my amazement, it was an English accent. For some reason, I expected American accents, but no, this film is set in London. Martin works for London Car Parks, a prestigious company by the sounds of it. He lives in a council flat with a mum who resents him for getting his nonce dad locked up for sexually abusing him. And this sexual abuse is no joke. Its delivery is excessive, definitely, but it's potent and adds another layer of grit-your-teeth roughness to the story. We're introduced to Martin Lomax's history of sexual abuse through a flashback sequence. It's not subtle or implied. It is there. We hear the sound of a baby crying and then a man's voice say, "Stop them tears, you're making daddy's willy harder," which I feel stumbled in its delivery somewhat. The line itself is a risky play, but the delivery comes off like a fumbled perversion of a pantomime dame. It's like they had Robbie Rotten come in to do a reading.
Stop them tears, you're just making daddy's willy harder.
It's unclear whether Martin was disabled from birth or whether the abuse he suffered was so intense that he became disabled, but it's certainly clear that his disability is exaggerated to the audience through its framing. This is achieved through Martin's muteness. He doesn't say a word across the course of the film, giving the impression of a disability so debilitating that he never speaks. Only other characters make frequent reference to him speaking. His mother reports him to his therapist because she says Martin has been talking about making a 12-person centipede. He corresponds with the agents of the actors from the original Human Centipede movie. He organises the viewings of the warehouses, to name but a few examples. I assume his muteness was an autistic decision, but the reasoning is just as likely to be that they wrote a script, added some shit in, and didn't readjust the rest of the script around it. Like I said, first draft vibes. Despite the contradictory framing, this works on the face of it because it renders it very difficult to make judgments on Martin's lucidity and conscious decision making. One of the scariest things about him as a character is his propensity for childlike behaviour, often resulting in impulsive decisions with little understanding of consequence. Martin's plan to kidnap 12 people and load them into a warehouse for gruesome surgery is something he undertakes on enough of a whim that it seems almost as though he woke up one day and just felt like it was something he was ready to do. Martin's plan, his entire blueprint of the surgery, is made from sketching the diagrams from Dr. Hayter's whiteboard during the first movie. It never even occurs to him to research surgical procedures because he is so childlike that he knows he will simply copy Hayter's work and it will all be fine. What's anesthesia? What's a clean workspace? And the little blue gloves they all wear? They don't even occur to him. In this way, Martin's in-the-moment thinking is the scariest thing about him. People in your day-to-day can be very scary, but 9 times out of 10 we can rest assured that the threat of consequence is what keeps them from doing anything drastic. If I woke up one day and had an inkling to make a human centipede, I would almost certainly fall at the logistics hurdle. Who to snatch, how to snatch them, when to snatch them, how to snatch them quick enough and with minimal evidence, where to store them, and then I'd have to begin planning an entire surgical procedure, and I'd need IV drips. I don't know where you get those. My dreams would fall to dust before they ever began. The thing about Martin is that he doesn't think far enough into the future to be hampered by that kind of thought process. That's the best part of this movie. That's the horror. Watching this unfold, knowing how little he thought any of it through is excruciating. He picks his victims by watching the cameras in the car park late at night. When he finds one or two suitably isolated folks, he knocks them out with a crowbar, duct tapes them up, and tosses them in the back of his car. He needs somewhere to store them while he collects his 12, so he inquires about a warehouse unit that's up for rent. When he gets in there, he tries to knock the owner out and accidentally kills him in the process. He's impulsive and messy. He kneels by the dead man and sobs, but you don't get the impression that he cries because he's sorry. He's crying because he knows the owner will miss out on the luxury of being in his centipede. To be harsh but clear, it's reminiscent of a toddler that squeezes a hamster to death because he doesn't know how to be careful. When it comes time for the surgery, we see some of the worst scenes in the entire movie. Worst as in excellent extreme horror, obviously. Not only are the practical effects excruciatingly on point, but the acting in all these scenes is stomach-churning, and I mean that as a compliment. Teeth are knocked out, a tongue is torn out, kneecaps are sliced open and the tendon chopped with scissors, to say the least. It goes on for a long time, and it is easily the part of the movie that shines the most when it comes to extreme horror. Not just because it's visually awful, obviously, but because it's hauntingly protracted. Everyone on set is working towards the goal of making sure you feel every snip. There's not a single member of the Centipede I wasn't fully convinced by. They were all fantastic despite having so little to work with, being bound, gagged, and told to fade in and out of consciousness. The standout for me was Ian, played by actor Lucas Hansen. He is disgustingly compelling in this role. I wasn't sold on him whatsoever in the first scene. He's arguing with his girlfriend about them being locked out of their car, and his delivery isn't great, especially for the first speaking role in the movie. When Martin shows up, it gets even worse. He starts squaring up to Martin, getting all in his face, bragging that he fucks his girlfriend. Bizarre shit. A real eyebrow raiser of an opener, I'll be honest. It was like porn acting. I half expected him to prove it right then and there, but when he's in the Centipede, it is good stuff. As with my observations of Ashlyn Yenny and Ashley C. Williams in the first movie, it's clear the actors in the Human Centipede 2 were chosen for their ability to convey incredible amounts of pain and emotion with only like a third of their faces visible. Lucas Hansen was the worst for this, as in the best. I'm confusing myself. Anyway, most of them act okay. Like, they read their lines and do a vague intonation in the direction of whichever emotion they've been told to convey, but when they get into the Centipede, it's like I'm watching a legion of people who have trained their entire lives for this moment. There is this one scene where the guy behind Ian manages to rip himself free, as in he manages to rip his mouth off Ian's backside. Not excellent to watch on its own, obviously, but when the camera cuts to Ian, we see him convulsing in agony. Ian does a lot of convulsing in this movie, and every time he did it, it made me feel like I was going to be sick. If I was 60% grossed out by a scene, all they needed to do was cut to Ian, his eyes rolling back into his head in agony, blacking out, shaking under the weight of inhuman torture, and I would be shrinking back into the sofa, feet planted, knees together, trying to squeeze the horror out of myself before I threw up all over my blankie. Martin Lomax's impulsive behaviour leads him down a road of no return. He is utterly reckless, not only to the consequences of the law, but also the consequences of fucking around too much with his new toy. You can tell he has no concept of the long term. His Centipede participants are all tossed into a warehouse for several days, while he slowly assembles all 12. I don't believe any of them are fed in that time, and he doesn't seem to notice or care. He's simply grabbing parts of an eventual whole and storing them for the moment he needs them. Why would they need food? His abduction methods also lack the same sophistication as Dr. Hayter's. Martin approaches people in the car park, typically shoots them, although that's optional, where did he get that thing, and then knocks them out with a crowbar. There's a lot of blood. It fountains out of their heads. At first I thought he was killing them until I saw his victims in the boot of his car, but no, he is knocking them out cold for the abduction. This is also how he sedates them in preparation for their surgeries, all of the pieces of the pede slowly coming to as he knocks out their teeth with hammers and staples them ass to mouth. Staples being the key word here. Martin initially attempts the same procedure as Dr. Hayter, slicing flaps into their booty cheeks that he can stitch onto the face of the person behind them in the Centipede. Only things don't go as planned. Attempting this on Peter Blankenstein, Martin discovers that cut fast and hope for the best isn't a sufficient hemostatic strategy, and Peter bleeds out on the warehouse floor in less than a minute. As I wrote this part of the script, I kept having to stop for a moment, take a deep breath, and look away. Never before have I been so stomach churned by something so horrifically squeamish that I have had to pause multiple times while writing a basic summary. This was very hard to watch. When he realises he'll waste more of his precious pede in the process of trying to imitate Dr. Hayter exactly, Martin basically goes, fuck it, and starts stapling lips to booty holes instead. This is the horror of Martin. Like, it's arguable as to how you interpret why Dr. Hayter ignores consent to make his centipede in the first human centipede. Does he see humans as animals, incapable of consent? Does he see the humans around him as so intellectually inferior that he assumes they'll understand the majesty of the situation once the surgery is done? Or is he just insane and his mentality surrounding his victims is lost in an overcomplication of insanity? For Martin, the sentiment is broadly the same, but from a different angle. Does he collect people because he assumes they'll want to play his game too? Does he see them as bugs, like he sees his centipede? Does he see them as even less, considering he at least remembers to feed his centipede? There's also an interesting potential parallel to his years of being abused. Martin knows he's doing something wrong, otherwise he wouldn't be doing this in a remote warehouse and knocking people out to get them there, but he still seems to assume his playmates are enjoying being used and abused. It draws a parallel to the way he was abused in secret by his father, kept behind closed doors, but with an assumption of consent. Martin doesn't understand consent. He can't even begin to comprehend it, and even if he did understand it on paper, he lives in a world where it is entirely irrelevant to him. Martin has been raised to understand that if you want to do something to someone, you just do it. Despite taking great pains to build his centipede over the course of about a week, Martin approaches it with the same enthusiasm as a quickly abandoned Christmas morning present. Like being several years old and unwrapping a great new doll you'll play with for like an hour max, chop her hair off and paint her nails up to her elbows, Martin approaches his new toy with childish irresponsibility. Kids don't know their pets need to be fed. They don't understand why you can't use iron grip to pick up a hamster. They don't understand why you can't throw a kitten. They assume things will be fine, and that's Martin's approach. This is most evident in the way he operates on them, obviously. He gives no thought to infections, but also in the way he abuses them. In a scene that was cut from the version I saw, the version on Shudder, Martin wraps his penis in barbed wire and sodomizes the woman at the back. This results in a really jarring cut, honestly. I don't mind that they removed the scene. I think they needed to in order to get it unbanned in the UK, so whatever. But the movie cuts so weirdly between the before and after that I ended up rewinding it a few minutes to see what I'd missed. Why Martin was suddenly draped over the back woman while her backside was absolutely streaming blood during the Centipede's escape attempt. That aside, yes, Martin mutilates his Centipede, causing irreparable damage he doesn't seem to understand will either cause her to bleed out or die by infection, and no intention to clean the wound or, not do it in the first place. Martin's impulsivity is his scariest attribute because he gives a lot of meaning to a phrase like, "a lot can happen in 2 hours." Although he loves his pet, he doesn't understand the concept of maintenance and care. He will have his fun, even if that fun results in a dead pet he spent the better part of a week putting together. Unlike Dr. Hater, who weans his pet into life slowly and takes great care not to accidentally kill it, hoping for an animal that will last him a lifetime, Martin Lomax subjects his participants to a few hours of the most unimaginable torture in exchange for just a few moments of fun. Both situations are situations you'd hate to be in, sure, but at least the first Centipede had a small chance of being saved, and I believe likely was saved after the credits rolled. Martin's not all childlike though. There are moments where we glimpse a cold-hearted psychopath through the whimsy. Sure, we get a snippet of him dancing in slow motion to the distorted sound of orchestral music as he forces his new creation to crawl around his feet, but we also get moments where he behaves with dangerous purpose. The first moment is when the front of the human centipede, Yenny herself, having been lured to the warehouse under the pretense of being invited to audition for a Quentin Tarantino movie, refuses to eat the food Martin tries to serve her. Silently, without hesitation or delay, and with purposeful precision, Lomax takes a feeding tube and stuffs it down her throat. He pushes that shit a long way down her throat as she retches and struggles. When it reaches her stomach, he pours a can of soup down there, then pulls the tube out in one big swoop and leaves her to come to terms with the violation. The second moment occurs when the centipede hatches an escape attempt. Distracted by the escape of a pregnant victim he initially assumed had died and left aside under some tarp, Martin Lomax rushes out to where she is making her escape, giving birth the entire time. In the silence, Dick, stapled to the back of Ian, rips himself free of Ian's backside, much to my horror, and the two centipedes crawl in separate directions, desperate to escape. When Martin finds them, he takes his gun and just starts to shoot them. No noise, no words, just a cold, silent glare. No hesitation. As far as horror movie antagonists go, I think Martin had the propensity to be one of the very best. A man without forethought or fear of consequence can be a very scary man indeed, and Lawrence Harvey nailed the vibe of a childlike predator to whom consent is just a jumble of sounds from a therapist's mouth. I think the creepiest, most ironic part of Harvey's performance is how much it garnered him a following of people who considered themselves like-minded. Even on the Human Centipede wiki page, he had some crazy lambasting him as though speaking to him directly for blocking him on Twitter and Instagram, lamenting that "I've changed my mind a lot about you. You and Martin aren't as alike as I thought." And that's a shame. I quite like Lawrence Harvey. He's always in interviews being like, thank you, Tom Smith, for the opportunity to play Martin Lomax in Human Centipede 2. It was fantastic fun. Loved every minute. And that brings us on to the themes. Themes aren't always a conscious inclusion to a piece of work. Sometimes they're incidental, and this feels the case for most of the themes across the Human Centipede 1 and 2. They are, however, unavoidable, symptoms of our upbringing and worldview. So let's take a look at a few now. The most obvious theme of this movie is parasocial relationships. This serves as the backbone of Martin Lomax's character, dialed up and amplified to the worst possible extent. He watches the Human Centipede on repeat at work. He has a Human Centipede scrapbook full of collages of stills from the film, pictures of centipedes, drawings, and red carpet photos of the cast. After watching the movie, he opens his scrapbook and traces his fingertips over it delicately. It's the most pristine thing he owns. In later scenes, we see his home, a classic council flat, extra shoddy, somehow looking even worse in black and white. His bedroom looks to be a shared space with his mother, who sleeps elsewhere but uses Martin's room to get ready for the day. Martin keeps his scrapbook under his bed like a dirty magazine, only it's his prized possession. He's worried that his mother will find it and judge him for it, and she will. Martin rewinds and rewatches the Human Centipede with the obsession of a child. When I was a kid, I rewatched my copy of The Rugrats in Paris Raw. I don't know why children do this, they just love soaking up every last second of magic in a movie over and over and over again. Either way, Martin has clearly been modelled off this kind of behaviour, contributing to his impulsivity and hedonism. He also admires Dr. Hater in particular. He buys and wears a similar lab coat when conducting his own surgery, only with nothing but a pair of boxers underneath that skew neither tighty nor whitey. The centipede is, as with with Hayter nothing but an object. His worshipping of Dr. Hayter conflicts miserably with his PTSD from childhood sexual abuse. I'll say it now, I have no problems with my extreme horror depicting one of the most excruciating ass-stapling scenes in cinema history, but Martin Lomax's childhood PTSD was so insensitively handled that I do not believe it deserved to be in the film. That said, I've got a whole section on this later, so for now I'll just describe it plainly and we'll dig into the analysis when we get to the why this movie is kind of shit section. So Dr. Hayter creates the human centipede as an affront to the natural order. He spent all his life separating conjoined twins, and in his insanity believes that he has split a whole into two lesser parts. He creates the human centipede because he truly believes it will amalgamate into a single higher consciousness, and he is genuinely frustrated when he realizes that they are still three separate people conjoined by needle and thread. He thought he was creating a creature that would simultaneously transcend its three composite parts and also be a loyal, submissive and loving pet. Hayter's long-term plan of having a loyal three-hound sharply contrasts with the childish impulse of Martin Lomax, who treats his hard-fought human centipede like a fly whose wings are there to be tugged off, a toy to play with, ruin and discard over the course of just a few hours. One of these ways is through the medium of sexual assault. As mentioned, he sodomizes the woman on the back of the centipede in a deleted scene, but his arousal manifests in other ways. In another deleted scene, he wraps his penis in sandpaper and gruesomely masturbates to the feed her scene from the first movie, in which Dr. Hayter cheers as Kitamura's character poops into the mouth of the middle piece. 6 adds a horrific squirt sound effect to the moment of Martin's ejaculation, which added a stunning edge of dark humour to the scene. Lomax is obsessed with the concept both of creating the centipede and being the centipede, specifically the front. When watching the feed her scene again, he screams in ecstasy and loudly shits himself. I was very surprised that he didn't put himself at the front of the centipede, although logistically that would probably be a nightmare. He's the kind of person who would willingly volunteer to Dr. Hayter. Lomax's obsession with the fiction of the human centipede and his parasocial relationship with the in-universe cast feed into each other hard. We learn through voicemails that he plays out loud that he has tried to lure the 3 original members of the Centipede to his warehouse under the pretense of inviting them to a Quentin Tarantino audition, knowing that he is doing wrong again, but doing it anyway. A lot of people see parasocial relationships as emotional dependence, this pretense between creator and viewer that they are mates, this overstepping of boundaries out of the muddying of professionalism, and that is true, but it's only one kind. On the other end of the spectrum, there are parasocial relationships in terms of personal grudges, personal hatred, but there's also parasocial entitlement, and this, I think, is the most insidious kind of parasocial relationship, because it's not an emotional one. You know when you hate someone or love someone, but do you know when you think you are owed something by someone you've never met? I know every single one of you would say, yeah, of course I would know, but I think it's something every one of us has done without realizing. Lomax inserts Yenny into the centipede because to him she simply needs to be there, like she is the cherry on top. She is as requisite a part of the centipede as the stitches he uses to bind it together. It's his impulsivity that lands her there so quickly and violently. Although never consciously explored, poverty in Britain exists as the backdrop to Martin's life so omnipotently that it may as well be represented by the black and white veneer we watch the movie through. So let's read way too much into this and dissect how it impacts the movie. When writing this section of the script, I made the extra effort to reach out to a friend who works in government and peppered him with hypothetical questions across the course of the morning about access to work schemes for people with disability, psychiatrists or doctors that do home visits, and resources available for those living in council flats. He was quite impressed by my interest, and when I revealed that I was asking on behalf of a movie about people getting sewn into a 12-man human centipede, he went quiet for about 10 minutes. He is a soldier though, so he came back. Martin and his mother live in a rundown council flat with an aggressive upstairs neighbour that physically assaults Martin when his mother bangs a broom on their ceiling in a bid to get him to turn his music down. They live on a diet of eggs and beans and other Blitz-era delicacies. Martin's bedroom is clearly a living room that has been refashioned into an extra bedroom, implying the building was once a family home that has now been split into several flats by the council, which is common practice. It also explains the wank noise insulation. Despite this, Martin does have a job, and even some kind of psychiatric doctor who visits him in his home to talk him through his feelings and give him medication for his asthma. It's really hard to judge Martin's capacity, considering it changes depending on factors ranging from if the camera is on him to if he needs to achieve something to keep the plot moving. If he can talk, surely he could interview for a job himself. If not, it's likely he'd be on an access to work scheme. If he is capable of interviewing by himself, his employer likely still would need to make adjustments for him as a person with a disability. It's probably not an intentional detail of the story and more a case of budget and time, but we hear nothing from his employers or his access to work caseworker, if he has one, demonstrating a system stretched so thin that people like Martin are left to fall between the cracks. Even an unscheduled visit from his boss would have raised his issues, potentially caught him in his obsession earlier, and acted as a barrier to his eventual rampage of kidnapping and mutilation. Martin's ability to masturbate at work, to kidnap with abandon, to behave however he wants, even on camera, depicts a society that has forgotten him. Issues with his mental health go unchecked and ignored. Speaking of, Martin's doctor/psychiatrist/therapist serves as yet another person who fails Martin. Dr. Sebring is a character that would repulse me one moment and have me burst out laughing the next. He visits Martin and his mother early in the film. Martin's mother has reported Martin to the doctor because Martin has been talking about making a 12-person human centipede, and she's concerned. Martin gets dressed and enters the living room where the doctor is waiting. Dr. Sebring initially seems like a warm and fatherly presence, and he is fatherly as far as Martin knows what a father is. Martin is initially distracted by his pet centipede, the only thing that gives him any visible happiness. He squeals with delight as he feeds his centipede, a scene accompanied by a hilarious snake-pouncing sound effect, like the centipede is some beast of the jungle. Dr. Sebring watches with a kind smile. Because Martin doesn't speak in this movie, despite being articulate off-screen, he has no words for Dr. Sebring when he asks Martin to explain himself. Even in these early scenes, you can detect something is wrong with Sebring. I initially assumed Martin shrunk away because he saw his sessions as a chore, like going to the dentist. When you see Sebring gripping and stroking Martin's thigh, and when you see Sebring bears a striking resemblance to Martin's father, you realise that there's something far more insidious taking place, like Sebring is a phantom of his father sent to haunt him. Dr. Sebring is not helpful. His observations border on bizarre, in part due to his line delivery. He explains that the centipede is phallic and aggressive, linking it to the psychological and sexual abuse by Martin's father. He then explains that mentally challenged, sexually abused people mutilate their own sexual organs, and I was like, wow, I thought I read too far into stuff. The film never makes comment on whether Martin's obsession with the angry phallic centipede has anything to do with his father, but it does confirm that Dr. Sebring's observations on Martin's self-mutilation masturbation sessions are correct, since we see him masturbating with sandpaper and wrapping his penis in barbed wire before raping the woman at the back of the centipede in the movie. He very clearly conflates pain with pleasure. Martin pisses blood after being beaten by the upstairs neighbour and seems completely unfazed. You might hope that Martin's mother would provide a warm and nurturing presence for her boy, but no such luck. Martin's mother despises her son and frequently voices a wish to kill him and herself. After years of sexual abuse by his father and her husband, Martin somehow managed to speak out enough to report his father, and then somehow followed due process enough that his father went to prison. His mother obstinately despises him for that and mistreats him from a place of resentment. She screams at him for shitting himself in his sleep after a PTSD-induced nightmare. She, in front of Dr. Sebring, announces to Martin that she misses her husband and it's Martin's fault he's in prison. She tells Martin to be a man, like his father, in the face of a furious neighbour. Shortly after the doctor leaves, she tells Martin that she has decided to kill them both. It's unclear whether her attempt to kill Martin is the trigger for his final step into insanity, the decision to do the surgery, or whether that was always his plan. I'm leaning towards the latter. The day before the surgery, the day she tries to kill him, Martin has his ducks in a literal row, waiting to be operated on when he gets a call confirming that Ashlyn Yenny is on her way, so he decides to delay it one more day to await her arrival. That night, his mother walks into his room with a knife and stabs a lump in his bed multiple times, but he's prancing ponied her. It's just a pillow. He's waiting in the doorway, staring at her resentfully as she shakes with terror. He climbs into bed without fear, in a sort of, well, go ahead then, way. But suddenly she can't bring herself to seal the deal. I kinda wish she had. As Martin visibly suffers a nightmare again, his mother slices her wrist with the blade and stares confounded at the wound. I was equally confounded as to the nature of her character. I don't think enough was explained whatsoever about this woman. There's plenty we can put together, but not enough. I don't think she even has a first name. Her inclusion was half-baked, and I can't tell if she struggles in her delivery because she herself wasn't given enough to work with, or if maybe this role was a bit too chaotic for her as an actor. These scenes are supposed to be impactful, but they really suffer when all you can do is sit there, stunned, wondering what on earth she is trying to achieve and cringing at her delivery.
100% medically accurate. Mouth to anus. Is this a perverted film you've been talking about?
When she finds his human centipede collage, she tears it to shreds as he cries helplessly. These scenes are so strange because we have a very frail old woman doing a 2 out of 10 rampage in front of her son, who could overpower but is likely too scared to, and is often in his underwear. It becomes a weird farce as a nearly nude mute man wails ineffectually at his mother, who visibly struggles to tear pieces of paper up. These scenes are pathetic and feel mean-spirited, like I can't tell if I'm supposed to be laughing. The worst offender here is her death scene, sorry, spoilers, which is is pitiful beyond all reckoning and juxtaposed by her brilliantly gruesome corpse. Martin holds his mother's head in the Centipede's tank until it bites her face. I didn't know this until I wrote the script for this video, but apparently centipede bites are excruciatingly painful. I don't think this is common knowledge, especially in countries where centipedes are something you'll only see in the bug houses at zoos. I think it should have been made clear, because watching this woman getting bitten on the face by a bug and falling to her knees melodramatically and screaming looked ridiculous. I assumed it would just be a little pinch. The doctor does mention centipedes as having a painful bite earlier in the film, but does so while making statements about how Martin owns one because it reminds him of his father's sexual abuse, so it flew over my head completely until the second watch. I think for such an unexpected danger it would have served to have had someone bitten earlier in the film to show the audience how painful it is. Don't throw it in as a useful note alongside some other exposition. So much about this movie would be improved with a bit more forethought into these scenes, how they'll look, whether they even make sense, how they're supposed to be delivered. As Mrs. Lomax writhes on the ground in agony, Martin leaves and returns with a crowbar he will use to cave her skull in. The practical effects are brutal and fantastic, and drags this scene up from poor to satisfactory. The still shot of him eating eggs opposite her in silence is the icing on this very gooey, unbaked cake. Dr. Sebring meets an equally miserable end as yet another person who failed Martin. Despite his initially warm intellectual vibe, we see him next in the back of a taxi, driver still present, getting a blowjob from a prostitute. He voices a grim wish to fuck Martin, mirroring the way Martin has been treated by the only other father figure in his life.
Oh, I'd rather fuck that retarded boy, but this'll do.
I know a place in Thailand where they specialise in that sort of thing.
But settles for the enthusiastic prostitute instead. Apparently it's only 50 quid to shag her in the bum, which I felt was quite a steal. That's insane value, by my understanding. Unfortunately, his plan doesn't bear fruit. Martin shoots the taxi driver, and Dr. Sebring is completely unfazed. Dr. Sebring asks Martin to imagine what his father would think, seeing him on a rampage like this, that Martin shoots him in the crotch and then in the head, killing him. Both of Martin's supposed support system, his mother and his doctor, treated him poorly. His mother out of resentment for him tattling on his dad's sexual abuse, and his doctor out of a subvert wish to be physically intimate with him. I believe the Human Centipede 2 tries to paint a picture of a tragedy that could be prevented, had Martin's support system been, at the very least, competent. But who knows, because it's honestly a shit film. Some of you will be here because you're curious about the movie but too grossed out by the concept to ever actually watch it yourself, so here's some quick-fire disgusting moments for you to sate that curiosity. See how many of them you can get through. He whacks everyone out with a crowbar so that they will be unconscious for the operation. They are not unconscious, however, and blearily begin coming to as he starts knocking their teeth out with hammers. The teeth fall into their throats as they moan in agony. He cuts a big line in their knees, reaches in with his dirty finger, and pulls their knee tendon out. He snips it with scissors. This scene is simple, but I could have vomited. I was so squeamish. He tries to emulate Dr. Hater by cutting triangles out of a man's booty cheeks to make the flaps that will be used to sew him to the face cheeks of the person behind. Martin cuts way too deep, carving him like a Christmas pumpkin, and blood floods out of this man in pints as he screams in gut-wrenching agony before dying of shock and blood loss. Realizing that this won't work, Martin then staples their lips literally to the asshole of the person in front. This one's not too bad, but combined with the onslaught we just faced, it's a scream fest. He then makes them crawl around while he dances with a blissful look on his face. Again, not the worst, but imagine the agony you'd be in after several operations undergone entirely without pain relief, crawling on the literal knees whose tendons you've just had snipped. Ashley and Yenny, the front piece of the centipede, refuses to eat, so Martin takes a feeding tube and violently crams it down her throat. There's a lot of sick, retching noises. When Ashley and Yenny screams too loud and too long for help, wanting to take a proactive approach to the situation as the assumed horror movie final girl, Martin responds by, in terrifying clinical silence, ripping her tongue out with pliers. The look on her face afterwards is beyond words. She is so in shock that she zones out and is no longer mentally present from there on. Frustrated that his human centipede won't do the thing and poop, Martin takes out a syringe of laxatives and administers it to everyone in the centipede. We hear a distorted backdrop of tummy noise sounds before the centipede all begin to violently shit. Martin laughs in delight at the sight of it. There's even an effect where it sprays onto the camera. As I mentioned before, this is the only moment in the film where anything is in colour, and it's the poo spray. As As he's used staples to combine the parts of the centipede, poop bubbles between the gaps and drips all over the floor. The girl at the back shits so violently that it sprays up the wall behind her. Martin vomits against the wall. This was actually the grossest part for me because it collects in this revolting cauliflower cheese lump on his lower lip that remains present for a long time, and I keep remembering it when I'm eating and it makes me lose my appetite. In a deleted scene that you can find extremely censored on YouTube, he wraps his penis in barbed wire and rapes the woman on the back of the centipede. The pregnant woman, originally assumed dead by Martin, bursts out of the tarp he laid her beneath and rushes out of the big warehouse. She is giving birth. Blood pours out of her as she runs, hitting the concrete floor with big loud slaps. As Martin pursues her to the car she has locked herself in, she gives birth to a baby. It slips off the driver's seat and falls under the gas pedal. She crushes it gruesomely as she drives away. As this happens, Dick rips himself free of Ian's backside, cue convulsing. We see the exit wound and it is not pretty. It looks like a prolapse. And that's it. Curiosity sated. You're welcome. For what it's worth, the practical effects in this movie are top notch. Whoever put these scenes together 100% deserved a fat paycheck. If you're looking for extreme horror, The Human Centipede 2 nails it. If you're looking for a good movie, it unfortunately misses the mark at every opportunity. So why isn't it good? For me, there's not much off limits in media. Anything can be included, but it needs to be earned. I think of it like a graph. Along the y-axis we have levels of extremity. Along the x-axis we have movie quality. I think the more extreme something is, the better your movie needs to be to justify it. Quality can often mean the difference between an audience feeling insulted, like you're just showing them pictures you printed off a gore website, and an audience feeling profoundly affected and disturbed. Although it's more case by case when it comes to mainstream media, I don't think there's anything truly off limits when it comes to extreme horror. That's what Extremity is all about exploring. In this movie, a woman gives birth in a car while being pursued by Martin Lomax. The newly born baby falls off the seat, slips under the pedals of the car, and the terrified mother crushes its head as she slams her foot on the accelerator and drives away. And I do not think this movie was good enough to earn that scene. After a movie that peaked at 5 out of 10 in its best moments, a scene like that comes off in much the same way as some freckled 12-year-old boy showing you Funky Town gore on his phone on the bus to school one morning. It's almost immature in its presentation, like someone sat down and thought, what's the worst thing I could show someone? What would really upset someone? Far be it from me to assume, but I don't think that's what Extremity should be all about, and I think it's worth holding this genre to a higher standard. Just because this scene made me uncomfortable doesn't mean this movie has merit, and it could have merit. Had it had even one reread of the script, one actual moment of critical thought about what was being said and done. I just don't think a 5 out of 10 film deserves to indulge itself in 10 out of 10 Extremity. I don't think yoinking together a shoestring budget and a cast of fresh-faced actors just for the justification of outrage marketing off the back of a few obscene scenes should be what Extremity horror sets out to do. It just comes off as a desperate effort to gain notoriety by any means possible. I think this genre should take itself more seriously if it wants to be taken more seriously. More specifically, however, the film is laden with plot contrivances, absolutely up to the ears in plot contrivances. God, imagine if, at the end, it revealed that it was all just a daydream. I'm glad they didn't go that route because that would have taken any quality out of this narrative, sewn it into a gory amalgamation, and killed it dead. I'm glad the film ended on the fruitless escape of the centipede, its stark and clinical euthanasia, and Martin Lomax miserably storming out of the warehouse, potentially straight into the open arms of the police, potentially to do it all again. Still, justice or not, nothing could have overcome the lingering consequences of the misery he brought onto others, and yeah, sorry, I promised I wouldn't complain, I'll stop doing the bit now. So yeah, plot contrivances. I'll list all the main ones I noticed for you now. Despite around 9 people going missing from London car park, a car park soaked in blood and brain matter, and we know Martin doesn't know how to clean that up, and their abductions taking place on camera, there's not a peep out of police or family interference. Martin knocks his victims out with a rough bludgeon to the head with a crowbar, causing them to bleed so hard I thought they died, but they're all basically okay. The victims are all sustained in the warehouse without dying of dehydration, despite some of them being there at least 5 days. None of the victims are able to escape from like 3 strips of duct tape around their arms. Even when it falls off their mouths, they don't crawl over to another victim and bite their restraints off. They basically just lie there for a week waiting to get put in a human centipede. As I said in my video on the Human Centipede 1, plot contrivances can often be a necessary evil to get stories moving, especially weirder stories that require a higher suspension of disbelief. 1 or 2 are fine, but basing an entire premise on them, using them like a handy box of tools whenever you encounter even a minor hitch in your story, anything that you'd have to write around carefully, leaves you with a movie that exhausts even a willing audience. Every time you indulge in a plot crutch, your audience has a choice to jump the hurdle with you or run into it and fall on their face, only to have to get up and keep jogging until the end of the movie's runtime. Every time you try to jump a hurdle, it will feel slightly harder than the one behind it. People can't keep jumping forever. For example, I can excuse the warehouse hostages surviving a week. It's not impossible and we don't know what occurs off screen, whether he does feed need them. The hostages are abducted in line with his separation from humanity and the death of his mother, and the Centipede is only created when he decides to take action on his own miserable life. It's a timeline marked by abductions, so that's comparatively easy to shrug your shoulders at and understand that not only does the story require it to proceed, but it is the story. That's fine by me. On the other hand, you couldn't possibly convince me that the lack of police or family involvement in the disappearances of 12 people exists for any other reason than it would be hard to write around that. Placing a problem in Martin's path that complicates issues to any real degree, requiring any kind of rewrite, was clearly beyond the will of the writers of this movie. Realizing someone might investigate those disappearances might require Martin abduct his abductees faster, frame a co-worker, or maybe be working somewhere less heavily surveilled in the first place. And that would take effort, so it doesn't happen. Like, we've already written the movie. What do you mean this doesn't make sense? I can't write a whole new script. That would take like 2 hours and I can't be bothered. Finally, the acting was bad. It was so bad that it felt like porn acting. And I wouldn't attribute that to the actors' performances at every turn per se. Yeah, sometimes the delivery was bad, but often they were just fed ridiculous lines and expected to deliver them and be taken seriously. Lucas Hansen screaming in Martin's face that he fucks his own girlfriend good makes her feel real good because Martin is merely looking at them comes off outrageous.
You wanna fuck you fucking her? No way in hell. Because let me tell you, there's only one guy who fucks her, and I fuck her real good.
Every spoken line in this movie was a coin flip. Tails for the worst delivery you've ever heard of a line that wouldn't be out of place in this movie's own porn parody, or heads for completely okay delivery. One of the movie's biggest issues is its representation of disability. Not to suggest that people with disabilities are immune to being evil, or that Martin's childlike impulsivity doesn't directly facilitate his gleeful sadism, but rather because Martin's disability is used as another crutch to facilitate plot points. Martin Lomax is as disabled as he needs to be to enact exactly the amount of evil he needs to enact at any point in time. The mere fact that he appears non-verbal to us, but off-screen is articulate enough to get the plot moving as and how it's required, is evidence of that picking and choosing. Martin's disability is not so much a part of him as it is a proxy Tom Six uses to puppet his arc, to render him a freak, quote unquote, to have him do things characters like Dr. Hayter would not do. As with all the other contrivances, Martin's disability isn't used so much as a fact of his character as it is a way to force the plot to get moving. Every time the film needs something to happen that requires an enormous leap of logic or motivation, Martin's disability is simply ramped up to accommodate it. Having Martin Lomax portrayed as this antithesis to the clinical, intellectual Dr. Hayter could work. Dr. Hayter is extremely book smart, but he's not wise or empathetic. The man's an idiot, quite frankly. I think there are a lot of ways the antagonist of the second movie could be a mirror to him without just going, what's the opposite of evil genius? Disabled man-child, and calling it a day. Once again, it feels minimal consideration to me. It's first draft vibes, and feels like the thing that came between Martin Lomax being an iconic villain of extreme horror, especially when you consider that Martin Lomax is the biggest victim of his environment, abused by both of his parents, clinically abused by his psychiatrist, abandoned and disabled by the system, and yet somehow he's 100% the bad guy. There's very little wiggle room there. It feels like disability is evil, which is, like, not true. All in all, not my proudest wank. Just kidding. I don't think I've ever had one I've been proud of. Overall, I think The Human Centipede 2 could have been far more than it was. The extreme horror scenes were perfect, they were excellent. Still, I don't think it makes me Anton Ego to ask for something a little better from everything surrounding those scenes. I might order a pizza for the toppings, but that doesn't mean I won't notice if you shaped the base and crust from human feces. I would be quite irritated by that, frankly. It's not unreasonable to look at something that barely scrapes a passing grade and say, I think this could be better. Lawrence Harvey offers the best possible performance you could expect of a terribly written character in a flat contrived story that could have been a fascinating tragedy and cautionary tale, and instead became, haha, imagine if a fat little disabled man fantasized about doing unspeakable harm to others and got hard from it. To see the wealth of ideas set up and gently slid by, like when someone walks past you at a cinema and you get a little 2-second lap dance, was a huge waste. The Human Centipede 2 didn't leave me angry. No. It left me disappointed. This is definitely worth a watch if you want to be repulsed. The Human Centipede 2 figured out the perfect recipe for making you curl up in your seat and wish to be set free from this mortal torment, and executed it in one long barrage on your senses. It is blow after blow after blow. This movie is pure psychic damage, but if you want to watch anything of quality, I would go elsewhere for now. Extreme horror deserves better than this, quite honestly.